Do you even know what you're doing to us right now? Margaret's voice cracked as she stood in my doorway, wine bottle trembling in her hand. 3 years of polite nods at the mailboxes, and here she was unraveling in jeans instead of her usual armor. The power was out. The building was dark. And this brilliant 51-year-old woman needed something I wasn't sure I should give. I know exactly what I'm doing, I said, stepping aside to let her in. The candles I'd lit threw shadows across her face, vulnerable, beautiful, dangerous. I'm Sebastian, 29, designer, and that night changed everything. But before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. I'd lived in apartment 2C for just over 3 years, long enough to know most of my neighbors' routines by heart. The quiet med student in 3A who came home at odd hours. The elderly couple in 2A who walked their corgi precisely at 7 each morning. And Margaret Winters from 4B who collected her mail every weekday at 6:15. Reading glasses perched on her nose as she sorted through envelopes with efficient precision. You could set your watch by Margaret's schedule. Monday through Friday, she'd sweep through the lobby in tailored blazers and practical heels, trailing a subtle perfume that reminded me of autumn. Weekends, she'd head out early with a leather portfolio or stack of files, returning late with takeout containers or grocery bags. Always moving, always busy, always wearing that polished smile that revealed nothing. I'd exchange pleasant nods with her at the mailboxes, sometimes catching fragments of her phone calls as she coordinated meetings or reviewed presentations. Her voice carried authority wrapped in silk, the kind of gentle command that made people listen without feeling commanded. We'd never had a real conversation, but I'd built up a picture of her life through these glimpses. Successful consultant, independent woman, completely self-contained. That Friday afternoon in October, I was hauling groceries up the stairs. The elevator was out again when I heard her voice floating down the 4th-floor hallway. Something in its tone made me pause. The confident silk had frayed, revealing an unfamiliar tremor. Yes, I understand completely. A pause. No need to explain further. I'll have my office cleared by Monday afternoon. I reached the 4th-floor landing to find Margaret standing outside her door, key suspended halfway to the lock. Her free hand pressed her phone tight against her ear, knuckles white with tension. The usual straight line of her shoulders had crumpled inward, as if absorbing a physical blow. Of course, very professional of you to call personally. Her voice steadied, but I caught the bitter edge beneath the words. Yes, goodbye. She lowered the phone slowly, staring at it like she'd forgotten what it was. For a moment, just a moment, I saw past the polished exterior to something raw and lost. The harsh fluorescent hallway lights caught the sheen in her eyes, the slight tremble of her lips before she pressed them tight. Then she noticed me watching. The transformation was immediate, shoulders squaring, chin lifting, professional. Mask sliding back into place. But it couldn't quite reach her eyes. They remained unguarded, bright with what might have been anger or grief. Good afternoon, she said, summoning a smile that almost convinced. Almost. I set my grocery bags down slowly, knowing I should just nod and continue to my floor. That's what our pleasant, distant neighbor relationship called for. But that glimpse of vulnerability had cracked something open in my chest, an ache of recognition, maybe, or simple human concern for another person's pain. Ms. Winters, I said softly, are you all right? Her smile faltered, just slightly. I'm fine, thank you. The key finally found its way into the lock. Just a business call. The kind that ruins a Friday afternoon, I offered, keeping my tone gentle. She glanced at me sharply, then away. A small laugh escaped her, barely more than a breath. That obvious, is it? Only to someone who's received similar calls. That drew her attention back to me. For the first time in 3 years of passing greetings, Margaret Winters really looked at me. I saw her register my age, probably younger than she'd realized. Saw her weighing options, measuring the risk of dropping her guard against the weight of carrying it alone. They do tend to wait until Friday afternoon, she said finally. Less messy that way, I suppose. Everyone goes home, has the weekend to process, returns Monday ready to be professional about it all. Her lips curved in a smile that held no humor. 20 years of consulting, I should know the playbook by heart. The fluorescent light flickered, harsh and unforgiving. Margaret's auburn hair, usually so perfectly styled, had started to escape its low bun. A strand fell across her cheek, and her hand trembled slightly as she tucked it back. I watched her key turn in the lock with a quiet click. The moment stretched, balanced on a knife's edge between polite dismissal and something else. Something. Unscripted and honest. The question slipped out before I could second-guess myself. "Is there anything you need?" Margaret's hand stilled on the doorknob, her back to me. The fluorescent lights hummed in the silence between us. I watched her shoulders tense, then deliberately relax, the kind of controlled response I'd seen her display 100 times in the lobby, maintaining that careful professional distance. "That's very kind," she said, turning to face me with what started as her usual polite smile. But something shifted mid-expression, a crack in the veneer. That made it softer, more genuine. "I'm fine, really. Just ... She paused, fingers tightening around her keys. "Thank you for asking. Most people wouldn't have." The warmth in her voice caught me off guard. It was nothing like her usual measured tone, the one she used for elevator small talk and mailroom pleasantries. This was different, raw and honest, in a way that made my chest tighten. "Well," I said, gathering my grocery bags, "I'm in 2C if you change your mind." Sometimes talking helps, even if it's just to complain about Friday afternoon phone calls. She nodded, that same soft smile lingering. 2C, she repeated, as if filing it away. Then she straightened, professional mask sliding back into place. "Have a good evening." I carried my groceries down to my floor, but the interaction stayed with me as I put everything away. The tremor in her voice during that phone call kept echoing in my head. I'd never seen Margaret Winters anything less than completely composed. Even when the elevator broke down last summer and everyone else was sweating and complaining, she'd simply adjusted her blazer and climbed 4 flights without a word. But today, for just a moment, I'd glimpsed something else. The way she'd gripped those keys, knuckles white with tension. The slight catch in her breath when I'd asked if she was all right. I tried to focus on making dinner, but found myself glancing at the ceiling, wondering if she was alone up there, processing whatever career blow that phone call had delivered. 20 years of consulting, she'd said. That's not the kind of experience you just replace overnight. Evening crept in earlier, now that October was settling in. I noticed the streetlights hadn't clicked on yet, which was unusual for this time of day. The shadows in my apartment grew longer as I washed dishes, my thoughts still drifting to 4B. When the power went out, it happened all at once. One moment I was drying a plate, the next I was standing in complete darkness. No gentle dimming, no warning flicker, just sudden, absolute black. "Perfect," I muttered, feeling my way carefully to the kitchen drawer where I kept emergency supplies. My fingers found the familiar shape of a flashlight, and its beam cut through the darkness. I located my collection of candles next, setting them up around the living room until a soft glow filled the space. Through my window, I could see the entire block was dark. No streetlights, no windows lit in the building across the way. Just the faint outline of trees against the darkening sky, branches swaying in the October wind. I settled onto my couch, resigning myself to an evening of reading by candlelight. When I heard it, a soft, hesitant knock at my door. Something in my chest jumped at the sound. I knew, somehow, before I even stood up. The knock came again, barely louder than the first time, but with a distinct pattern I recognized from countless mailroom encounters. I grabbed one of the candles and made my way to the door. It's warm, light throwing strange shadows across the walls. My hand rested on the doorknob for just a moment as I remembered that careful smile, that flash of vulnerability in the hallway earlier. Then I opened the door to find Margaret Winters standing there, illuminated by her phone's flashlight. She'd changed out of her work clothes into what looked like a soft sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way I'd never seen before. The professional mask was gone, replaced by something more uncertain, more human. "Tu say," she said, softly, with a small self-deprecating smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." I found myself staring for a moment, taking in how different she looked from just hours ago. The Margaret Winters I knew from hallway encounters wore tailored blazers and carried leather portfolios. This version stood before me in a cream-colored sweater that looked soft enough to sink into, her auburn hair falling in loose waves past her shoulders. In one hand, she held up her phone's flashlight. In the other, a bottle of wine caught the glow of my candle. "Not at all," I said, stepping back to let her in. "I was just thinking how quiet it is without power. Without power." She crossed the threshold, the warm light catching silver threads in her hair I'd never noticed before. "I brought this," she said, lifting the wine bottle with a slight self-consciousness that seemed so unlike her usual confidence. I was sitting up there thinking, well, drinking alone in the dark felt a bit too symbolic after the day I've had. Something in her voice, that same raw honesty from earlier, made me want to ease whatever weight she was carrying. "I have glasses," I offered, "and a decent view of the blackout from my balcony, if you're interested." "That sounds perfect, actually." The relief in her smile was subtle but unmistakable. I led the way through my apartment, moving slowly so she could follow my candle's light. "Watch the coffee table," I warned, navigating around furniture that suddenly felt like obstacles in the shadows. "The balcony's just through here." The sliding door opened to my small concrete balcony, where I kept 2 chairs and a tiny table. Nothing fancy, but it caught nice evening breezes. The city spread out before us, unusually dark except for the occasional flash of emergency lights or car headlights threading through streets below. "Let me grab those glasses," I said, leaving her to settle into one of the chairs while I ducked back inside. When I returned with 2 wine glasses, she was leaning forward slightly, taking in the altered cityscape. The candlelight softened her features, making her look younger somehow, or maybe just more at ease than I'd ever seen her. I set the glasses on the small table between us, and she opened the wine with practiced ease. "It's nothing special," she said, pouring. "Just something I keep around for ... double quote." She paused, then gave a small laugh. "Well, for evenings when the power goes out and I end up knocking on neighbors' doors, apparently. Those kinds of evenings happen more often than you'd think," I said, accepting the glass she offered. The comment earned me another laugh, quieter this time but genuine. We sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, sipping wine and watching the strange darkness below. The usual city sounds seemed muffled, as if the blackout had thrown a blanket over everything. Even the October breeze felt gentler than usual, carrying just enough chill to make the wine warming. "It's strange," Margaret said finally, her voice soft. "I've lived here 5 years, and I've never seen the city this quiet." She traced the rim of her wineglass with one finger. "Makes everything feel ... different, like normal rules don't quite apply." I watched her profile in the candlelight, noting how she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. There was something larger behind that observation, I could tell, something she was working toward saying. I'd seen this before in client meetings, the way people sometimes needed to circle around difficult topics before diving in. "Different can be good," I offered, giving her space to continue if she wanted. She turned slightly toward me, and I caught a flash of that vulnerability from earlier, mixed now with something that looked like curiosity. "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes different is exactly what you need." The candle flickered between us, throwing dancing shadows across her face. She took another sip of wine, and I could almost see her gathering her thoughts, building a bridge from small talk to whatever had really brought her to my door tonight. Margaret took a longer sip of wine, then set her glass down with deliberate care. 8 years building this consulting practice," she said, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. 8 years of 60-hour weeks, missed holidays, proving myself over and over. She gave a soft, bitter laugh. And at 51, I thought I was past the point of having to justify my existence to every new executive who decides to restructure. I stayed quiet, sensing she needed the space to let this out. The candlelight caught the tension in her shoulders, usually hidden beneath those precise blazers. You know what the worst part is? She turned toward me, green eyes reflecting the flame. I saw it coming. Started noticing the signs months ago. New management, shifting priorities. But I convinced myself that if I just worked harder, proved my value one more time. She trailed off, shaking her head. That's what they count on, I found myself saying. That need to prove yourself. It's how they keep us running faster and faster on the hamster wheel. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Sounds like you're speaking from experience. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the dark liquid catch the light. Different field, same story. Client work pays the bills, but I hesitated, surprised by my impulse to share something I rarely discussed. Each project takes a little more from the creative well, you know, until you're just empty. The design awards in your hallway suggest otherwise, Margaret said softly. I looked up, startled. She smiled, a slight flush coloring her cheeks that wasn't entirely from the wine. The building newsletter did a piece on you last spring, she explained. I may have read it more than once. Actually wanted to ask you about your work, but she gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. Didn't want to be that nosy neighbor from upstairs who doesn't know professional boundaries. Something shifted in my chest, a recognition that while I'd been timing my mailbox visits to catch glimpses of her, she'd been noticing me too. All those polite nods and careful distances suddenly felt like what they were, a dance we'd both been performing. I would have liked that, I said, meaning it. Still would. The wine bottle sat half empty between us, marking time in reverse as we filled the darkness with truths we might never have shared in daylight. Margaret told me about her divorce 8 years ago, how she'd thrown herself into building her practice as a way of proving something to herself. I shared my struggles with commercial work versus personal projects, how each year it became harder to remember why I'd fallen in love with design in the first place. Sometimes I wonder, she said, leaning back in her chair, if we spend so much time proving ourselves to others that we forget how to just be. The breeze lifted a strand of her hair, and she tucked it behind her ear with an unconscious grace that made my throat tight. Does that make sense? More than you know, I replied, watching how the candlelight softened her features, making her look both younger and somehow more real than the professional version I'd known from our hallway encounters. It's like we create these personas. The successful consultant, the commercial artist, and then get trapped inside them. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. And then when something breaks that image, she gestured vaguely at the darkened city. Well, here I am, drinking wine with my downstairs neighbor instead of updating my LinkedIn profile like a proper professional should. I'm glad you are, I said, the words coming out before I could second-guess them. Here, I mean. Instead of LinkedIn. Her eyes met mine across the small table, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The city's unusual silence wrapped around us like a cocoon, making this moment feel separate from regular time, regular rules. So am I, she said finally, her voice carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with wine. She reached for the bottle, tipping it toward my glass in question. Should we finish this? The darkness had settled into something comfortable, like an old blanket wrapped around our shoulders. We'd finished the wine a while ago, but neither of us seemed ready to let the evening end. Margaret had suggested tea, and I gratefully agreed. Wanting to keep my head clear for every moment of this unexpected connection, I watched as she cradled her mug, her silver-streaked hair catching the candlelight. The professional mask from earlier had completely dissolved, replaced by something softer, more real. She'd kicked off her shoes, tucking her feet under her in the chair, and the gesture struck me as endearingly vulnerable. "Can I ask you something?" she said, breaking our comfortable silence. "Why aren't you out at bars tonight?" "It's Friday," Surely there are better options for someone your age than sitting in the dark with your upstairs neighbor. I considered deflecting with humor, but found myself wanting to give her the truth instead. Honestly, those scenes feel increasingly hollow lately. The same conversations shouted over too loud music, everyone performing versions of themselves instead of just being. I traced the rim of my mug, gathering my thoughts. I'd rather have one conversation like this, real, layered, meaningful, than a dozen nights of surface-level socializing. Margaret studied me over her tea, her expression complex, something between curiosity and disbelief, with an undercurrent I couldn't quite read. You know, she said finally, I'd assumed you'd see me as just another invisible middle-aged neighbor. Men your age typically look right through women mine. She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. We become part of the wallpaper, familiar but unremarkable. You could never be invisible, I said, the words coming straight from my heart before my brain could filter them. I notice everything about you. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, and I found myself continuing, wanting her to understand. The way you hum in the stairwell when you think no one's listening, usually something classical, but sometimes pop songs you'd probably never admit to. Knowing this earned me a surprised laugh. How you always have 2 coffee cups on Monday mornings, and the second one's usually empty by the time you reach the 4th floor. You've been paying attention, she said softly, something shifting in her gaze. Hard not to, I admitted. You're the most interesting person in the building. The candlelight flickered between us, casting shadows that made the moment feel suspended in time. I could see her processing my words, the slight flush rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with wine or tea. When you say things like that ... She set her mug down carefully. It makes me wonder if... She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. If what? She met my eyes then, and the intensity there made my breath catch. If I'm reading too much into this evening. If I'm seeing something that isn't. She gestured vaguely between us. Sometimes life hands you these moments that feel like they could be the beginning of something, but they're complicated, messy, full of reasons why they shouldn't happen. She stood suddenly, wrapping her arms around herself. I should probably go before. She stopped herself mid-sentence, leaving the thought unfinished. The air between us felt charged with all the things we weren't quite saying, all the possibilities we weren't quite acknowledging. I wanted to ask her to stay, to finish that sentence, to explore whatever this connection was becoming. But something in her posture, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she'd physically created distance, told me this wasn't the moment to push. I stood too, careful to maintain the space she'd established. The candle flames wavered with our movement, sending shadows dancing across her face. In that shifting light, I could see both versions of Margaret, the polished professional I'd known from the hallway, and this newer, more vulnerable woman who'd shared her fears and failures over wine and tea. Both were equally compelling, equally real. She was looking at me now, her expression holding a question she seemed afraid to ask. The city's darkness pressed against the windows, creating an intimate bubble that made everything feel both more possible and more dangerous than it would in daylight. The room felt different as we both stood, shadows stretching across the floor between us. Margaret swayed slightly, not from the wine we'd finished hours ago, but from rising too quickly after sitting so long. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand finding her elbow to steady her. The fabric of her sweater was impossibly soft under my fingers, and then we both froze. The simple touch seemed to stop time itself. Margaret looked up at me, her green eyes reflecting the candlelight, all her careful walls completely down. I could feel the warmth of her skin through the knit of her sweater, and neither of us moved to break the contact. "This is probably a terrible idea," she whispered, but she didn't step away. If anything, she seemed to lean slightly into my touch, as if drawn by some invisible force. "What is?" I asked, though we both knew exactly what she meant. The air between us had transformed into something electric, charged with possibility and hesitation in equal measure. My heart was pounding so hard, I wondered if she could hear it in the quiet room. She gave a small, shaky laugh. "You're 29, she said, the words carrying the weight of both obstacle and enticement. The way she said my age made it sound like a confession, something dangerous and thrilling. "And you're brilliant," I responded, surprising myself with my directness. "And interesting. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since I saw you in the hallway today." The candlelight played across her face as I spoke, highlighting the elegant line of her cheekbones, the slight parting of her lips as she processed my words. I watched the emotions flow across her features, surprise first, then doubt, and finally something that looked dangerously like hope. She drew in a breath that seemed to shake slightly, and I realized my thumb had begun tracing small circles against her sweater, an unconscious gesture of comfort or connection, or both. "You can't mean that," she said, but there was a question in her voice, an openness that hadn't been there before. "I do," I said simply, "every word." The candle flames danced in the subtle movement of air between us, casting Margaret's face in shifting light and shadow. That perfect professional mask she usually wore was completely gone now, replaced by something raw and real and beautiful. I could see every nuance of emotion as she wrestled with what was happening, the way her eyebrows drew together slightly, how she caught her lower lip between her teeth, the subtle flex of her fingers at her sides. She hadn't moved away from my touch. If anything, the space between us had grown smaller, though I couldn't say which of us had moved. The darkness pressed against the windows, wrapping us in our own private world where normal rules and boundaries seemed less solid, less important. "I'm old enough to," she started, but I gently interrupted. "To know exactly what you want?" The words came out softer than I'd intended, barely more than a whisper. Her eyes widened slightly at that, and I watched as a flush crept up her neck to her cheeks. The candlelight made it look like she was glowing from within. She swallowed, and I found myself tracking the movement of her throat, awareness of every small detail suddenly heightened. "That's not playing fair," she murmured, but there was a smile hiding at the corners of her mouth. "I'm not playing at all," I said, and felt her small intake of breath through my hand that still rested on her arm. We stood there in the flickering light, balanced on the edge of something that felt both inevitable and impossible. The city's darkness pressed against the windows, but in here, in this space we'd created, everything was warm and close and tinged with possibility. I could smell her perfume, something subtle and elegant that I'd caught hints of in the hallway for 3 years, but never this clearly, never this intimately. Margaret's hand lifted slowly, deliberately, and I held my breath as her fingertips found my jaw. The touch was featherlight but purposeful, her skin cool against mine. Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her eyes that made my heart stutter. "Do you truly understand what you're saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Each word carried weight, carefully chosen. "What it means? To start something between neighbors?" Her thumb brushed along my jawline, the gesture almost unconscious. As if she couldn't help herself, I remained still under her touch, aware of every point of contact between us, my hand still at her elbow, her fingers on my face, the subtle way we'd drawn closer without either of us really moving. The candlelight caught the silver threads in her hair, making them shimmer like starlight. "I understand perfectly," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice despite how my pulse raced. Her fingers trembled slightly against my skin, and I knew she was offering me an exit, a chance to step back and pretend this evening never happened. But the hope in her eyes told a different story. She wanted me to stay exactly where I was. The rational part of my mind ticked through all the reasons this shouldn't happen. 22 years between us, living in the same building, the complications that would inevitably arise. But stronger than any logic was the pull I felt toward her, not in spite of her age, but because of everything she was. The strength in her vulnerability, the grace in her uncertainty, the way she'd let me see past her careful walls tonight. I leaned down slowly, deliberately, giving her plenty of time to step back if she wanted to. Her fingers slid from my jaw, to rest against my neck, neither pulling me closer nor pushing me away. I stopped just short of her lips, close enough to feel her breath warm against my face. The invitation was clear. The final choice had to be hers. The moment stretched between us like honey, sweet and slow. Margaret's eyes searched mine, and I could read every question there. What would this mean for both of us? How would it change our carefully maintained distance in the hallways? What would happen when the power returned and reality crashed back in? Her breath hitched slightly, and I watched the internal struggle play across her features. The professional mask was long gone, leaving only Margaret, real and vulnerable. And beautiful in the candlelight. Her fingers curled slightly against my neck, and I felt rather than heard her soft inhale as she weighed what crossing this line would mean. The darkness pressed against the windows, holding us in our own private world where age was just a number and neighbors could become something more. The candle flames danced in the subtle movement of air between us, casting shifting shadows that made everything feel dreamlike and possible. I stayed perfectly still, letting her take all the time she needed. Her perfume wrapped around me, subtle and elegant, making me dizzy with how close we were. The soft wool of her sweater under my hand, the warmth of her skin against my neck, the way her eyes kept dropping to my lips before meeting my gaze again, every detail burned itself into my memory. "This changes everything," she whispered, but she hadn't moved away. If anything, she'd swayed slightly closer, until I could feel the words against my lips. "I know," I breathed back, watching her eyes darken at the sensation. The candlelight flickered across her face, highlighting the moment of decision in her expression. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly on my neck, and I felt the subtle shift in her posture that told me exactly what she'd chosen. The yes, that left her lips was barely more than a breath, but it changed everything. Margaret closed the distance between us, and when our lips met, the contact was soft, questioning, each of us still seeking permission even as we granted it. Her fingers curled more firmly against my neck, and I drew her closer with the gentlest pressure at her elbow. The initial tentativeness lasted only moments before something deeper took over, an urgency that spoke of attraction that had been building far longer than either of us had admitted. Weeks, maybe months of carefully timed encounters at the mailboxes, polite greetings that lingered just a heartbeat too long, all of it crystallized into this kiss. Margaret's other hand found my shoulder, steadying herself as she rose slightly, on her toes to better match my height. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing unsteadily. The candlelight caught the flush on Margaret's cheeks, and her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. She took a small step back, though her hand remained on my shoulder. "We need to talk about this," she said, her voice husky but determined. "We need to be absolutely clear about what we're doing here." I nodded, suddenly grateful for her professional instincts even in this intimate moment. "You're right." We returned to our seats, but the careful distance from earlier was gone. Our knees nearly touched, and I could still feel the phantom pressure of her lips against mine. Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "First, the obvious," she started. "I'm 51. You're 29. That's not a small gap." "It isn't," I agreed. "But it matters less to me than who you are." She gave me a look that was equal parts touched and skeptical. "It should matter. Not just the years, but where we are in life. What we want, what we're looking for." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've been married, divorced, built a career, lost contracts. I'm not looking to start over or pretend I'm younger than I am." "I would never want you to," I said, leaning forward slightly. "The woman you are right now with all that experience, all those stories, that's who I'm drawn to." Margaret's expression softened, but she pressed on. "We're neighbors. If this goes badly, we'll still see each other. Every day." "True," I acknowledged. "But if it goes well, we'll see each other. Every day." That earned me a small smile, but she wasn't finished. "I need to say this very clearly." She met my eyes directly. "I don't need saving. Not from my age, not from my career setback, not from anything. If that's what this is about for you." "It's not," I interrupted, then apologized for cutting her off. Sorry, but I need to be equally clear. I don't need you to make me feel mature or sophisticated or whatever you might be thinking. I don't have some fantasy about older women teaching me about life. Margaret raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to continue. What I want, I said, choosing each word deliberately, is more nights exactly like this one, with you specifically. Conversations that matter. Moments where we both drop our usual masks. I want to learn who you are beyond the professional woman I see in the hallway, and I want you to know me as more than the young designer upstairs. She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if searching for any sign of insincerity. And the fact that I'm old enough to be your mother doesn't bother you. You're not my mother, I said simply. You're Margaret, the woman who hums in the stairwell and drinks 2 coffees every Monday morning. The one who just kissed me like she's been thinking about it as long as I have. Color rose in her cheeks at that, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she reached out and took my hand, her fingers cool against my palm. This won't be simple, she warned, but there was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. Simple is overrated, I said, squeezing her hand gently. I'd rather have real. The candlelight caught in her eyes as she looked at our joined hands, then back to my face. Something had shifted in her expression. The professional mask was completely gone now, replaced by a vulnerability that made my heart ache in the best possible way. I watched Margaret process my words about wanting more nights with her, studying the subtle changes in her expression. The professional armor she usually wore, the careful mask I'd seen in countless hallway encounters, continued to soften. Her fingers were still intertwined with mine, and I felt a slight tremor run through them as she accepted that I was completely serious about pursuing whatever this connection might become. You really mean that, she said quietly, not quite a question. Every word. Something shifted in her eyes then, a decision made. Margaret released my hand, but only to reach for me, drawing me closer with a certainty that hadn't been therein. Our first kiss. This time, when our lips met, there was no hesitation, no careful testing of boundaries. Her fingers slid into my hair as she pulled me down to her, and I wrapped my arms around her waist, eliminating the last space between us. The kiss deepened. Speaking of all the unspoken moments that had led us here, every casual greeting that had lingered too long, every shared glance that had held more meaning than we'd admitted. I could feel her heart racing against my chest, or maybe it was mine. The distinction didn't seem to matter anymore. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing differently, the air between us charged with possibility. The candles on the small table had burned dangerously low, their flames flickering warning signals in the darkness. We should head inside, I suggested, reluctant to break the moment, but aware of the dying light. Before we're left completely in the dark. Margaret nodded, but paused at the threshold between balcony and apartment. She turned back to look at the darkened city spread out before us, its usual electric glow replaced by an unusual blanket of stars. I understood the impulse. She was memorizing this moment, this exact point where everything had shifted between us. It's beautiful, she murmured, and I knew she meant more than just the view. It is, I agreed, letting my hand rest lightly at the small of her back. We stepped into my apartment together, the space feeling different now, more intimate than it had even during our earlier conversations. The remaining candles cast long shadows that danced across the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt removed from ordinary time and usual social constraints. Margaret moved to the center of my living room, her figure silhouetted by the faint light. When she turned to face me, there was something both vulnerable and determined in her expression. Ask me to stay, she said softly. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. This wasn't just about conversation anymore, and we both knew it. The way she'd phrased it, not a statement or assumption, but an invitation for me to make another choice, told me she was still giving us both an opportunity to pause, to reconsider the line we were about to cross. I crossed the room to stand before her, close enough to see the flickers of candlelight reflected in her eyes. Stay, I said, my voice low but clear, not just for tonight. Not just for whatever happens next. Stay because I want to know every layer of who you are, because I want to discover all the stories behind your smiles, because I want to learn what makes you hum in the stairwell when you think no one's listening. Margaret drew in a shaky breath, her composure wavering at my words. You make it sound so simple, she whispered. Not simple, I corrected gently, echoing our earlier conversation. Real. She reached up to touch my face again, her fingers tracing my jaw with a tenderness that made my heart ache. Ask me again, she said, her voice barely audible. I covered her hand with mine, turning my face slightly to press a kiss against her palm. Stay, Margaret. Please stay. Stay, I whispered again, and Margaret's fingers tightened in mine. The simple touch felt more intimate than any kiss, her hand fitting perfectly against my palm, as if we'd held each other this way 1,000 times before. I looked down at our intertwined fingers, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. The remaining candles cast long shadows through my apartment as I guided her down the hallway, each step measured and deliberate. The gentle pressure of her hand in mine spoke volumes, trust, desire, and something deeper neither of us was ready to name. You know those moments when time seems to slow down, when every detail burns itself into your memory. This was one of those. I could hear our footsteps against the hardwood, could feel the slight tremor in her fingers that matched my own racing pulse. The darkness ahead of us felt like velvet, soft and welcoming, wrapping around us like a cocoon. The hallway had never seemed so long or so significant, these few steps becoming a journey, each one carrying us further from the safety of simple friendship into uncharted territory. At my bedroom doorway, I paused. Moonlight spilled through the window, painting silver paths across the floor and catching in Margaret's hair, highlighting those beautiful streaks of silver she never tried to hide. I turned to face her, releasing her hand only so I could cup her face between my palms. Her skin was warm against my fingers, and I could feel her pulse flickering rapidly at her throat. Are you absolutely sure about this? I asked softly, my thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. We can stop here. Go back to the living room, talk more, or you can head home. No pressure, no expectations. Margaret's response wasn't immediate, and I loved her more for that, the way she gave weight to every choice, every moment between us. Then she smiled, that real smile I'd only started seeing tonight, the one that transformed her entire face and made her eyes crinkle at the corners. Her hand slid up my chest, coming to rest at the nape of my neck where her fingers threaded through my hair. The gentle pressure was all the warning I had before she pulled me down to her, eliminating the last breath of space between us. This kiss was different from our others, unhurried, deep, filled with intention. There was no hesitation now, no careful testing of boundaries. Her mouth opened under mine with a soft sigh that I felt in my very bones. I wrapped one arm around her waist, drawing her closer as her fingers tightened in my hair. The kiss deepened naturally, like a conversation we'd been meant to have all along. Every point of contact between us felt electric, her hands in my hair, my palm against the small of her back, the way she pressed closer until I could feel her heartbeat against my chest. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing unevenly. Margaret's eyes met mine in the darkness, and I saw everything I was feeling reflected there. Desire, yes, but also trust, affection, and that peculiar mix of certainty and wonder that comes with discovering something precious and unexpected. I reached behind us, finding the doorknob by memory, and guided us both into my bedroom. The soft click of the door closing behind us felt momentous somehow, like the sound of one chapter ending and another beginning. Through the wall, I heard the last candle in the living room sputter out, as if the universe itself was granting us this privacy, this moment that belonged only to us. Moonlight streamed through my bedroom window, creating patterns of silver and shadow across the floor. It caught the auburn in Margaret's hair, traced the elegant line of her neck, painted her skin in ethereal light. The darkness felt like permission, like sanctuary, like a world that existed only for us. Standing there in the moonlight, Margaret reached for me again, and I went to her willingly. This time, when our lips met, it felt like coming home to a place I hadn't known I was searching for. My hands found her waist as hers slid up my chest, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that neither of us had any intention of stopping this time. The night stretched ahead of us, full of promise and possibility, as infinite as the darkness beyond my window, and as intimate as the space between our heartbeats. I woke to the gentle hiss of my coffee maker and the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing. Unfamiliar morning music in my usually quiet apartment. For a moment, I lay there just listening, a smile forming before I'd even opened my eyes. Margaret's humming drifted down the hallway, the same unconscious melody I'd heard so many times in the stairwell, but now it was here, in my space, making everything feel different. The power must have come back overnight because sunlight streamed through my windows, bright and clean. I pulled on a pair of sweatpants and followed the coffee aroma to my kitchen, where I stopped in the doorway, taking in the sight before me. Margaret stood at my counter wearing one of my old T-shirts, the soft gray fabric falling to mid-thigh. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the morning light in ways that made the silver strands shimmer among the auburn. She moved through my kitchen with easy confidence, finding mugs and spoons as if she'd done this countless times before. When she turned and saw me, there was none of the awkwardness I'd half expected, no morning after regret shadowing her eyes. Instead, she smiled, that real smile I was quickly becoming addicted to, and gestured toward the coffee maker with a spoon. "I hope you don't mind. I figured after last night we both could use the caffeine." I crossed to her, drawn by something I couldn't name, and wrapped my arms around her from behind. She leaned back against my chest immediately, her body fitting against mine as naturally as it had hours before. We stood there for a moment, watching the coffee drip, her hands coming to rest over mine where they crossed her waist. "I need to leave soon," she said softly, but made no move to step away. "There's paperwork to deal with, calls to make about the contract situation." She turned in my arms, looking up at me with clear eyes. "But I wanted this first, a proper morning. A proper goodbye. A proper acknowledgement that last night wasn't just about the power outage or wine or momentary weakness." Her hands came to rest against my chest. "It was real. And I wanted you to know that." I noticed something on the counter by the coffee maker, a sheet torn from my notepad, Margaret's handwriting flowing across it with an elegance that made even my grocery list paper look sophisticated. "No regrets. Your move next." Looking up, I found her watching me read it, her eyes holding that fascinating mix of assurance and openness I was discovering was uniquely hers. She stood in my kitchen doorway, fully dressed now in yesterday's clothes, but somehow looking even more intimate than she had in my T-shirt. The challenge in her expression was clear, but beneath it lay something softer, more vulnerable, a question waiting for my answer. "Dinner," I said, my voice morning rough but certain. "Tonight. Here. Again, or anywhere you want to go." I crossed to her, needing to be closer as I added, "I meant what I said about wanting more time with you." That wasn't just talk. Her smile warmed her entire face. Here would be perfect. Less complicated. She reached up, straightening my collar, though I hadn't put on a proper shirt yet. 7 o'clock? 7, I agreed, and she rose on her toes to kiss me, a lingering press of lips that held nothing back. When she pulled away, her cheeks were flushed, making her look younger while somehow emphasizing everything wonderfully mature about her. I watched as she gathered her things: phone, wine bottle from last night, the sweater that had started everything. At my door, she paused, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that made my breath catch. No words needed. Her eyes said clearly this was just the beginning. After she left, I stood in my living room, breathing in the lingering scents of burned out candles and her perfume. Outside, the city hummed with restored power, traffic noise and construction, creating its usual morning symphony. But inside these walls, everything had fundamentally shifted. I picked up her note again, running my thumb across the words. 22 years between us. On paper, it sounded impossible. In reality, It felt like the most natural thing in the world. I started mentally planning dinner, already knowing I wanted to make tonight even better than last night. Age was just a number when everything else aligned this perfectly. If this story found you at the right time, subscribe and set reminders. Tomorrow's might be the nudge, the hug, or the promise you've been waiting for.